Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started here in just a minute as folks trickle into our webinar. Welcome to the webinar on the impact of the One Big Beautiful Bill, or OB3, on student basic needs security. We'll see you in just a moment. All right. Once again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bryce McKibben, and I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Hope Center for Student Basic Needs at Temple University. We're very pleased to welcome you to our webinar today on the impact of the One Big Beautiful Bill, or OB3, on student basic needs security, to discuss more about how this major legislation is going to be shaping college affordability for the years to come. I'm thrilled to be joined with a remarkable set of panelists here today. Another one of our own Hope Center staff, Mark Hulsman, our Director of Policy and Advocacy, Vivian Anguiano at the Center for American Progress, who recently joined as a Managing Director for Higher Education, Jessica Thompson, Senior Vice President at the Institute for College Access and Success, or TICAS, and Gina Plattanino, who is Interim Director for SNAP at the Food Research and Action Center, or FRAC. Many of you have worked with these amazing folks in a variety of capacities, ranging from issues affecting public benefits and our core programs that support basic needs security and college affordability in many areas. And they're going to bring a wealth of knowledge to our conversation today. Next slide, Mark. We want to recognize that as we start the conversation today, we are talking to you in the middle of a very difficult context. We have an ongoing federal government shutdown that has neared a record length, cropping up on the second longest shutdown in history. And we have a significant food cliff approaching us this weekend, starting on November 1st, with a recent announcement from USDA that they would not be releasing November SNAP payments. These challenges, along with a coming healthcare cliff and potential spike in costs under the Affordable Care Act, might be top of mind for you. Certainly, we recognize that we're going to be talking to you about a specific piece of legislation, OB3, which will have major impacts, but these other contextual events and things that are happening right now on the federal policy front might be something that is a little bit more top of mind for you in the daily challenges you're facing on your campuses, in your states, systems, in whatever context you might be joining us from today. So we are going to discuss the intersection of these current events with the larger policy changes that have been enacted under OB3, and try to make sure that this is a topical and timely webinar for you today, while also making sure that we give you the solid content and information you need to understand this bill. It is important to note, too, that the shutdown does impact the implementation of some of the OB3 provisions. Agencies are in various places across the federal government and implementing this law, most of which will occur over the next 2 years. Some provisions started immediately or were effective, backdated to July 4th of this year when OB3 was signed, and others come online more gradually, but some agencies need to issue guidance and conduct rulemaking to implement these changes. So things are a little bit all over the map, from our health, education, nutrition programs, and so forth. Next slide. So today we're going to be talking about OB3, One Big Beautiful Bill, which is a reconciliation bill, and we want to talk to you a little bit about what that is. Reconciliation is a measure that is sort of known mostly to folks who follow Capitol Hill closely and few others, but it is often called a budget bill. It is a purely partisan procedure in the United States Congress, mostly meant to help overcome the Senate filibuster. Reconciliation can be passed with a simple majority and signed by the president. It is not subject to the 60 vote threshold usually required to pass something into law through Congress, or which is in a little bit of an oversimplification, but it means that it is not eligible to be filibustered. In this particular context, it meant that the current majority, the Republican majority in the House and Senate, were able to craft their own bill without any input from congressional Democrats and have that signed by President Trump. As a result, much of the content reflects that sort of singular partisan policymaking process, and a lot of folks have questions about what that means for the future. This particular bill, OB3, does differ from other reconciliation bills that we've seen in the past in some key ways. First of all, most reconciliation bills, including as recently as 2021, but also the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which we'll talk about briefly, have mostly been used to sort of increase overall the amount of benefits that have been provided to taxpayers, to folks who live in the country, to residents, and rarely as a large cut. This has changed over time. Reconciliation, when it was first created by Congress, or the pathway, did allow for it to be used for deficit reduction, and there are some examples of that happening. But in recent history, the bills have not contained enormous cuts to the programs that we're going to talk about today. This bill did contain those level of cuts. In fact, the OB3, or One Big Beautiful Bill, contained $1.1 trillion in overall reductions to education, health, and nutrition programs, which will include SNAP and federal financial aid we're talking about today, while extending, for the most part, the 2017 tax cuts, or the Trump tax cuts that they've been called. The net impact of this, the 1.1 trillion taken away and then the tax cuts extended, results in about $3.4 trillion added to the federal deficit over the next few years. It could be higher by some estimates of 5.5 trillion over the next decade if all of the provisions were to be made permanent. Next slide. So to belabor the point, this particular bill, OB3, was primarily a tax bill. The purpose, its origin from it, was to address the expiring tax cuts of 2017, but it did add on all of the other cuts that we're going to be talking about, and that's why we wanted to discuss with you the impact on student basic needs and security, because it wasn't necessarily the thing that got the headlines. We know that there's a huge range of impacts from this bill across higher education, that the bill touches pretty much every part of our higher education system and public benefits system that you can imagine, but its role in how students afford their non-tuition costs, from food, housing, transportation, childcare, and more, will be felt very, very deeply across the country. Even just within the federal financial aid pieces, this has been called a mini reauthorization of the HEA for its changes across student loan caps, repayment, federal financial aid programs like Workforce Pell. So even just in that small part of the bill, we're talking about very, very historic and widespread changes. And obviously, there are many more across the other programs we'll talk about today. So I'm going to hand it now over to Mark to talk a little bit about the context of student basic needs security as we have it today, and then we'll also talk through it with our other panelists before we take some of your questions, and look forward to having that conversation with you today. Take it away, Mark.
Thank you, Bryce. And thanks for everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk quickly because I want to get to our expert panelists on some of the really specific provisions of this bill that are going to impact student basic needs in the short and medium and long term. But I think just to start, I think it's important to ground ourselves in the moment and the experiences that students faced in the lead up to the passage and implementation of this bill. So we know, and probably the majority of the participants on this call know, and I don't need to belabor the point, that we have faced a crisis of basic needs insecurity in higher education for, frankly, as long as we've been tracking it. And these are figures that you see on the screen from our most recent Hope Center Student Basic Needs Survey that find, again, consistent with what we've seen in other surveys, and certainly as long as this survey has been running, that 3 in 5 students are experiencing basic needs insecurity related to food and or housing. This is where the college affordability crisis meets the lack of public benefit or social safety net supports that students and families in this country have often had, right? We have a threadbare social safety net that really hits students when they can least afford to meet what are pretty acute and deep cuts, or deep costs rather, as they're trying to get through their degree program. So again, 4 in 10 experience food insecurity, about half are experiencing some form of housing insecurity, and maybe about 1 in 7 are experiencing homelessness. And we know that these challenges with material basic needs and security, are often sort of intersecting with other challenges that students face. So we know that a very large number of students face challenges with mental health related to anxiety and depression. About 1 in 5 experience transportation challenges getting to and from their class, or their obligations while they're in school. 1 in 8 are experiencing just connectivity issues with internet and technology, especially important in the sort of post-pandemic hybrid environment that students found themselves in. And about 1 in 5 parenting students in higher education are experiencing childcare challenges. And I use this not to just throw stats at the screen, but to say this is the policymaking environment that a Republican trifecta in entering sort of federal policymaking faced, and in some cases explicitly um, uh, promised to help alleviate, right? Bringing down costs for families, addressing affordability challenges that people were facing, especially over the past few years. And again, Bryce mentioned the sort of use of reconciliation as a partisan tool to pass, domestic tax and spending priorities. This could have been a bill where a majority that it was elected in the House and Senate, and a White House of the same party could have really taken the moment to understand what families were facing with regard to, obviously, the direct cost of college, which is the thing that we're all focused on, but food prices, rent prices, childcare costs, healthcare costs, right? Things that, due to macroeconomic factors, due to sort of long-term neglect, or due to active policy choices, think tariffs and things like that, have gotten worse over the past couple years. I want to touch a little bit, and not too long, on that sort of moment, that policymaking moment that we faced this summer and this year, with the long-term causes and consequences of what's been a college affordability crisis. And we could have a whole webinar or series of webinars on this. So this is an oversimplification, but one of the reasons that families have been facing, increased costs of higher education and increased costs of attendance, is the lack of sufficient state support for public higher education and grant aid, including the Pell Grant, that has not kept its purchasing power over time. So, the way that we sort of fund higher education through a combination of state and federal investment and sort of a voucherized system of higher ed, in terms of federal financial aid, has not sort of kept its basic promise with families that those without financial resources would have their costs met at the point of entry. So we have an insufficient amount of state support, an insufficient amount of grant aid. Obviously, there are many consequences of that, including people not attending higher ed at all because it's too expensive. But student debt is one of the major consequences of this affordability crisis. And I say this because we often don't think of student debt as a student basic needs issue, but many of the provisions of OB3 that my fellow panelists are going to talk about relate to the federal loan program. So when student debt becomes the consequence of the student basic needs crisis, the terms of the loan program that students are going to have to take on, or the basic pact within the federal loan program, become even more important. And obviously, some of the provisions, not to spoil it, are making the student loan safety net as we know it much more punitive and damaging for students. In addition to the federal financial aid program, and this is sort of my last little moment on the soapbox, we have, in addition to an aid program that has not kept its basic pact with students, we also have a safety net that in many cases specifically penalizes students relative to other populations that may be eligible. So we know that the student SNAP rules are complex, they're outdated, they're harmful. Students sort of stand alone in this very sort of punitively treated population within the student SNAP rules, and I'm sure Gina can talk about that at length. We know that when students face emergency costs or unexpected costs, that emergency aid is inefficient to meet those needs, and campuses don't often have the resources to help students meet what can be an acute financial emergency. Housing supports broadly are very minimal. Students are often locked out due to sort of, again, punitive rules in various housing programs, so they can't access what little affordable housing supports there are. We know, as a father of two, I know that childcare is growing increasingly expensive, while the availability of high quality childcare, specifically for students on campus, declines across the country. And then there's all other kinds of hidden costs that students face, both when they enter college and sort of after the fact. So students face hidden tax penalties if their Pell Grants go towards living costs. That there are federal support programs that they may have qualified for 1 year, particularly students who went to college starting in the pandemic, but have since expired. And there's sort of a litany of and an alphabet soup of programs that students could have accessed or were expanded during the pandemic policymaking moment, but have since expired. So that's what students have been facing in the lead up to this bill, and I'm excited to turn it over to my panelists to talk about how it all got worse. So not to leave on a down note, but excited to move forward with, I think, Gina, who's next, and I'll control the slides. So just poke me with a stick for when I should go to the next slide. So Gina, take it away.
That was a lot. And I think we need to acknowledge everything that individuals are going through in order to just make their basic needs. And one of the most basic needs that we all have in common is the human right to food. This bill has the most dramatic cuts in history for SNAP. And it's important to know why SNAP matters, right? It's our first line of defense against hunger. It reduces healthcare related issues, and it bolsters local economies, right? Next slide. And when we talk about bolstering local economies, it also provides jobs, it provides federal and income taxes, and all of this is going to be threatened as we look at what the reconciliation bill is going to do, just really briefly. And as we're also talking about the impact of SNAP, it's important also to know that this economic impact cannot be offset. This federal responsibility cannot be offset by private charity. Next slide. For every meal that our wonderful heroes out there are providing, SNAP provides 9 meals. And those 9 meals go into paying the local grocery store, right? The local grocery store pays property taxes, and those taxes go into being able to fund various basic needs that sometimes individuals take for granted. Next slide, please. And as we look at the whole, we also know that there's a lot of inequity in terms of access to basic benefits. We know the majority of people who utilize SNAP are white community, and then half of that really is, and less than half of that is our African American and Hispanic community. And these are terms that the U.S. Department of Agriculture utilizes it, so I'm utilizing their terms. They're not necessarily mine. And that's extremely correlated to food insecurity rates, right? Terms to access to SNAP also goes into connected to food insecurity rates, and also other basic needs. Next slide. They can decide today to also participation. Who is on SNAP, right? We do know that many people with basic needs issues and who are in this webinar have children. Majority of people who are on SNAP are children, followed by older adults. And then we have our other bucket, which is adults 18 to 59, which many of the individuals that we work with are within this space. And the access to these basic needs is also directly correlated to poverty and the poverty rates that we do see. And this is why, as we think broadly in terms of basic needs, we're going to see a lot of access issues and how much work can be done to ensure that there is equity. Next slide. Yes, we can hear. So what are these cuts? I keep saying, oh, these horrible cuts. They're the most historical cuts into the program. And just really briefly, you know, it takes funding away from like nutrition, agriculture, from SNAP and education. It expands how many people fall to this like work for food requirement. We have it in our SNAP rules that continues that if you are going to school at least half time, you have to work for food unless you meet some exemptions. And Mark and Bryson, we can tell you all of these exemptions that are in place. But it just says that people who are 18 to 64 now have to work 20 hours, have to show at least 20 hours a week in order to get SNAP in order to continue getting SNAP. If not, they are cut off for 3 months in a 3-year period. And one of the exemptions is actually going to institution of higher ed. So just sort of flagging that for individuals. what we're going to see for those of you who may be on SNAP is that there might be a small reduction if you are getting fuel assistance, if you're not an older adult or have a disability, because some of the things that had taken out was that the automatic eligibility of you be able to show that you get fuel assistance. So you're going to see a very weedy, but if all of a sudden you notice like a $10 decrease, that's where it's coming from. And from those of you who may work with lawful non-citizen individuals, those who are like humanitarian based, immigration statuses like refugees, asylees. The bill takes away bipartisan work and protections that have been there historically. And so whenever USDA issues the guidance, although I will flag that some states have already implemented this, will lose access, will lose, so refugees, asylees, SBI will lose access to SNAP unless they get a green card. Okay, so just want to flag for those of you who work with a specific population. And all of this comes into play because now also states are going to have to pay more administrative funding, and in some states, the benefit costs. And all of these are fundings that could have been utilized to do affordable childcare or meet the other basic needs that we are all talking about, which is incredibly harmful when you think about it in terms of what could be done. Next slide. So what does that look like, right? Having to do all of this is more funding, less access for states to be able to work on ensuring that individuals have access to SNAP in higher ed institutions, have access to be able to have other resources because now they have to focus on these issues. And if we look at next slide, if you look at who is impacted, majority of states will have to pay a benefit cost. And just keep in mind that SNAP has never had a line item budget. So states are going to have to shift priorities as to like what is important to them in order to keep this from being funded. Next slide, please.
We do apologize, Jay.
If you look at
Our next speaker will be Jessica Dorr.
then as we look at the most top 5 populous states and what we look at, like what the impact will be, again, look at those impacts and what it looks like for individuals and states to be able to prioritize. Next slide. Sorry, and I'll end there. What you need to know is that this has disastrous impacts for your community when you might be seeing like, oh, why all of a sudden, if you have children, why all of a sudden am I not getting that teacher that my child needed, or why am I getting these resources, is because of this bill. But you as a student, the rules continue the same. It's just the states may not be able to prioritize it. So it takes us advocates really working within this space to be able to ensure that you have the access and the resources to be able to complete education. And I'll turn it over to my colleague who will talk more about these issues.
Hello, everybody. I know there are some questions already come in. We'll have a chance to answer some of those when we get through our presentations. I'm going to dive in a little bit to some of the Pell Grant and loan changes and accountability and eligibility changes on that were contained in the bill. And I will, as Mark said, like we could dive into the details of these for an entire webinar. So I'm going to try to stay really focused on the things that I think are going to be most important, particularly around anti-poverty and basic needs concerns as we are focused on here today. One thing I'll say in terms of the Pell Grant program, which you saw a bit earlier in terms of Mark sharing how much the purchasing power of that grant has gone down over time and how that has contributed to the college cost crisis and also correlated with increases in debt. I will say that thankfully a lot of the initial significant cuts to Pell eligibility that were proposed in the House version of the bill did not make it through to the final form. We did get some changes to Pell in the final bill. I've listed them out here. I want to focus on 2 in particular that I will say to folks will impact a very small number of students, but I think are causing some concern and confusion for folks on the ground for good reason. So one, they did cut off eligibility for students with an SAI, that's the new EFC, that equals or exceeds 2 times the maximum Pell Grant award. So that is for the 26-27 award year, that would be $14,790. If your SAI was above that, regardless of whether you would have qualified or not, that you would not be eligible for Pell. Again, we anticipate that this will affect a very small number of students whose AGI is low compared to their non-income assets, as reported on the FAFSA. But it remains to be seen how this takes effect and what it looks like on the ground. The other thing I will say is that there is a really confusing provision in there that says that if you receive full ride scholarships, so non-federal aid sources, from institutions, from private entities, etc., that fully meet your entire cost of attendance, that's your books, your housing, your food, in addition to your tuition and fees, that you are not eligible for Pell in addition to that, regardless of what your SAI might indicate. So an example of that would be an athlete who's on a full ride scholarship. There is a lot of confusion about this, and I do just want to say that from the legislative language and intent, we do not believe that this is an attempt to change Pell's status as a first dollar program. But I will say that it is on the list of something that will be addressed by the department in a negotiated rulemaking starting in December. So they will be putting out some guidance and information on how they're going to regulate on this. But I know that there has been a fair amount of confusion around what that provision means. So I wanted to point those out, and I will say that we believe that these will affect a very small number of students, but that by reopening the financial aid formula in this bill in this way to make these tweaks, lawmakers did make some major policy decisions with very little understanding of potential unintended consequences or complications, and they may have created administrative burden that may outweigh any changes that actually occur as well. So it will be a close one to keep an eye on. So that's the primary thing I wanted to say about Pell. Next slide, Mark. I just wanted to say, as you saw, this mirrors what Mark shared earlier, that you can really see the maximum Pell Grant there as the blue line, and you can see this is tuition fees and room and board, so that's the total cost of attendance at a public four-year college, and you can see that change over time and how that purchasing power of Pell has declined because it hasn't kept up. That's a big part of the affordability crisis in higher ed. Next slide, Mark. Also, I just want to emphasize the Pell Grant is the most effective investment that the federal government makes in higher education. It is dollars directly in students' pockets. It is incredibly targeted to students who are coming from low-income households. And you can see here the vast majority of Pell students come from households that make less than $40,000 a year. Or if you look in total, less than 60,000 is almost all. So again, very heavily targeted, really important resource, as I think you all know. It can be used for all costs of attendance, and so you can get a refund and use that to help pay your other costs, your non-tuition costs as well. Really important to keep a close eye on what happens with that. We're going to talk a little bit more about the extension of Pell Grants to short-term programs in a minute here. That was another big change that was included in this bill. Next slide. So a couple of things I want to say about changes to Title IV eligibility in general. So Title IV is generally the financial aid, access to federal financial aid. And we're going to talk about the short-term certificate program. So again, that was the big change to make Pell Grants available. Historically, programs needed to be at least 15 weeks in length at a Title IV eligible school in order to be eligible for Pell Grants. This bill has changed that, and it's going to start July 1, 2026, more to come in a minute, to programs that are as low as 8 weeks, right? So it extended Pell Grant eligibility from 8 to 15 weeks. So that was a big change for the Pell Grant program. Another thing I do just want to flag, I won't spend a lot of time on it. We're going to keep a close eye on this and watch how it plays out, but the bill also created a new earnings test for degree programs, undergraduate degree programs, so BA, and graduate degree and certificate programs. And there they created a test that you need to meet a median earnings threshold when you compare like a bachelor's degree holder to a high school degree holder. And for graduate degrees, it's a bachelor's degree holder compared to the graduate degree holder. A lot of questions about how this is going to be implemented, how they're going to collect the data, how they're going to calculate it, etc. That will be also determined at the negotiated rulemaking by the Department of Education in December and January. But I do want to emphasize this is new. And what this means is if you don't exceed and meet this new threshold on the earnings of your graduates of your program, that you could lose access to the loan program entirely. Next slide. So I just want to focus in on some of the concerns that we have for students and for colleges in general around some of these Title IV eligibility changes. One, again, I want to say that a lot of these changes were made very quickly in a process that is very top down, very fast, and doesn't go through the traditional congressional sort of process where there's a lot of input. Bills go through the committees of jurisdiction. It really is a fast, in the dark, much more political process, as Bryce laid out at the beginning. A lot of times what that means is that really big changes get put in there without a lot of thought having gone through to unintended consequences. And so I do want to say, again, risking losing loan access based on the new income threshold is something we're going to have to keep a really close eye on what that means for students and colleges and certain degrees and career pathways. Again, creating uncertainty for long-time gainful employment rules around the new income threshold does not apply to certificate programs, whereas the gainful employment rules that have been around a long time do. So there's a gap and a question about how the Department of Education is going to make sure that we're being really consistent, we have good data, and that we're applying these metrics in a very robust way across all programs. I do want to say that again, we don't have a lot of data. And so we don't yet know if this is going to be effective at protecting students from low value programs. So a lot to come. It was a change that was made without a lot of data being run and without there being a lot of data available. So the other thing I will say, and I'm going to dive into this a little bit more, is the workforce Pell Grants. That's the short-term programs. Again, there is a lot of promise in there, could support adult learners and workforce transitions. But again, it's going to be really important whether or not we have strong guardrails and make sure that those are quality programs and that there's strong oversight on those programs so that we make sure that students are using their Pell dollars for programs that are high quality and provide a return to that student and not just use their Pell dollars up in ways that aren't helpful. Next slide. I want to mention here, it doesn't get as much attention because it was, can you go back a sec, Mark? I just want to mention this. This wasn't as much of attention paid to this in the course of the bill, given all the big changes. But they did delay two really important regulations that help protect borrowers when they are defrauded by schools, which has been particularly a problem in the for-profit college sector. So what's called the borrower defense and the closed school discharge. They delayed those rules. And I just want to say this can be really important because then when you have big school closures like Corinthian colleges, or you have defrauded students, they really have lost now this easier access to relief to relieve them of the loans they took out in that fraudulent context or in that closed school context where all of a sudden, unless they transfer, they then lose sort of any value that they thought they were getting from being in that program. So again, I do want to flag that for folks that is a change that also has been made that puts borrowers at risk and reduces protections. Next slide. So this one, limits on graduate and parent borrowing. I think this is another one where I will say there's been a lot of conversation for years on whether or not the Graduate and Parent Plus programs, which allow parents or graduate students to borrow pretty large levels of federal dollars, right? They can borrow all the way up to the full cost of attendance for graduate programs, which can be very expensive, I think, as we all know. That has really increased graduate and professional, or been correlated with an increase in graduate and professional borrowing over the years. However, the limits that were included in this bill, again, really hadn't had the tires kicked on them, haven't really been put through the ringer in terms of what might unintended consequences be. So what I want to flag for folks here is that there is a new annual and lifetime limits that are put on, for example, graduate and professional student borrowing, right? And the $100,000 a year or the $100,000, maximum amount aggregate limit might not sound too terrifying unless you're going to be in medical school. But if you start to think about the $20,500 for a PhD student, for example, a graduate student per year, that's the new limit per year. And a lot of analysis is showing that up to anywhere from 20 to 40+% of graduate students historically and currently would exceed that cap, right? And the big concern is that this is going to push folks into the private student loan market, which historically we would call is as risky as putting your higher ed on a credit card. High interest rates, required co-signers, much fewer protections for borrowers. in the private market. And also, obviously, the private market is not available to all equally. They are going to use underwriting, and folks who are sort of less worthy credit-wise are going to have less access to that anyway. And so we're really concerned that we could have unintended consequences here in terms of where they set these limits, on what that might mean for pipeline issues around important programs like medicine, nursing, even teaching. So I think that's a really important one to think about and focus in on. I also want to mention the Parent Plus borrowing, HBCU schools and MSIs in particular. You see high levels of Parent Plus borrowing there. A lot of that related to the racial wealth, intergenerational wealth gap, right? That this has been a really big, lifeline for accessing credit in order to cover college costs for people's children. And there will be a disproportionate impact on, these new caps on those types of institutions that are enrolling a lot of students that really don't have any intergenerational wealth or even like housing assets to tap into, and have been relying on these federal dollars in order to pay those bills. So a lot of valid questions over the years on these loan programs, but do want to emphasize that these new limits are concerning, and we want to keep a really close eye on what it means for the availability of programs in general, because schools are going to lose revenue, but also access, and looking at increasingly less diverse pipelines in terms of historically marginalized populations being able to access graduate and professional programs. The other thing I will mention is that because professional degrees get access to a higher cap, 50,000 annually, for example, as opposed to the 20,500. There is a big sort of push right now within the negotiated rulemaking where the Department of Education is figuring out how to define these and implement these rules. What that means is they're trying to argue in a lot of schools want as many of their programs as possible to be classified as professional, so they don't have such a big impact from these changes. So far, the department has been very resistant to that argument, and they are looking at wanting to continue with a pretty the historic approach to what counts as a professional versus a graduate program. And just to give people a sense, professional degrees are pharmacy, dentistry, vet, chiropractic, law, medicine, optometry, osteopathic medicine, podiatry, theology, right? So there is a lot of hot conversation right now about whether or not they might be able to, expand that definition. That's going to be, a decision that ultimately has a lot of impact on how much this rule changes lending behavior. Again, I do just want to emphasize that we also are incredibly concerned about what this might mean for private borrowing. And I will just say that private borrowing really peaked during the Great Recession. And just before the Great Recession, we saw it up to about even 20% in professional degree students. After the Great Recession, it really plummeted back down to around 5%, and it's been there ever since. And we are unfortunately anticipating a big run up again, particularly around graduate and professional students, because I think a lot of private companies see them as pretty good bets. And so, they can tend to be an attractive population to come in and give credit to. So, but again, the rates and the protections are usually, very much subpar compared to federal loans. So again, big changes coming there. I do want to say also it's been given less attention, but it could end up being really interesting and important and impactful for students, is that institutions are now going to be allowed to set even lower annual loan limits for students and parents, as long as they apply that policy consistently to all students within the same program of study. The other thing they're going to be allowed to do for the first time is to prorate loan eligibility based on attendance status. So for folks on this call who are in higher ed, you know that Pell Grants are already prorated based on attendance status. If you have part-time, you don't get a full Pell Grant. Loans have not operated that way. They now can. And so I do want to point that out. So you're going to see some variations starting to happen across schools. Some schools may start to manage some of the issues in this bill. Like, for example, we looked at the income threshold that they're going to be facing by programs earlier. And if they're worried about some programs, you might see them start to use this kind of authority that they now have to say, well, yeah, that is the limit, but we're going to make it even lower for students who are in this program, for example. So I want to flag that as well. And it's really yet to be seen, like how all these pieces are going to come together and what that's going to look like for loan eligibility. I will emphasize that there were no changes made to undergraduate borrowing limits or to the subsidized student loan program. Again, we were very worried about those things in earlier versions of the bill. So there is that to be said, although this ability for institutions to lower those limits for programs in their own institutions is a new authority that the bill creates and could impact undergraduate students. Next slide. So again here, I just want to emphasize, likely to increase reliance on expensive and risky non-federal loans. Likely to create financial pressure, potentially significant, on colleges and universities due to lost revenue and enrollment, and likely to limit access to high-cost programs and increase financial barriers for lower and middle-income students. So this is where, I just want to think about this. And again, not to say that the situation has been perfect in terms of the debt levels for graduate and professional degree programs, but that these changes are likely to have some pretty significant impacts on the field that are going to play out over time. And again, this is all taking effect July 1, 2026. Let me say also, so folks know, if you're a current student, there is a 3-year, if you are already enrolled before July 1, 2026, there is a 3-year grace period where you are not subject to these new caps. So essentially, sort of the regime in which you were enrolled under in terms of loan limits will persist for 3 years. Next slide. I just want to mention, this is the last thing I'll mention. As Bryce mentioned earlier, this really is a tax bill as well. And there were a few education-related tax changes in here. One, the endowment tax on high wealth institutions. This is not most institutions, but it's quite significant for very wealthy institutions, did go up. And the other thing I want to say is that 529 accounts were expanded again to cover more costs. So now you can, before they had made an expansion to allow you to use it for K-12, for private schools, for other types of costs. So really just making these accounts more and more flexible and be able to use for more and more things. Taxation of discharged student loan debt. So one, I will say the package did extend total student loan, like non-taxation of discharged student debt if it's related to total and permanent disability. However, treated separately is this question of discharged student debt related to income-driven repayment plans, right? And that was not extended. So that will sunset, and Congress is allowing that tax protection to sunset this year. So for anybody who is looking to hit their 20 or 25 years of total payments and be forgiven within income-driven repayment, then you would now be looking at having to pay a tax bill related to that discharged debt and the amount of discharged debt. Again, that's not true for PSLF because that's related to a particular type of employment, and so it's not subject to taxation. And it would not be true for total and permanent disability discharges because Congress did extend this non-taxation for total permanent disability. But for anyone in income-driven repayment, this now becomes an issue again that Congress needs to address. So I think that's it. That's all I want to mainly say here so we can move on and get to question and answers.
Thanks, Jessica, and we'll turn it over to Vivian.
Thank you, Bryce, and thank you, Jessica. First, it's great to be with you all. I started my career working on a college campus, and so I know how important it is for students, especially with all of these new changes and complexities, not only in the student aid system, but in the loan repayment system and in basic needs broadly, for them to generally have more information and connection with individuals who can help them navigate these challenges. So thank you so much for the work you're doing. I'm Vivian again. I work at the Center for American Progress, which is a progressive think tank here in DC. And formerly was in the Biden administration White House, where we worked on significant student loan reform, as well as increasing college affordability at large. What I wanted to talk about today is also in the context of the new law. I will try to be very brief because so we can have enough time for questions. But I did just want to note that you've heard a lot of details today because the changes in the new law are very, very significant. In fact, a significant share of the funding that was used to pay for the tax cuts in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act did actually come from the higher ed space because of the amount of funding that is provided to students in student aid. So if it sounds like these are a lot of changes, that's because they are. And the lack of college affordability and changes to the loan program to make payments less affordable are being routed and used in other places. So I wanted to talk about student loan repayment and just share as the top line overarching theme of the new law is that student loan repayment will certainly be less affordable. It will be less flexible, and it will have fewer protections for borrowers. Primarily what happened in the law is that all existing income-based repayment plans for new borrowers were essentially gutted, and a new repayment plan was created called the Repayment Assistance Plan, or RAP. And functionally, what happens in this new system is that if a borrower is new, meaning that that individual does not have loans or doesn't have any loans until at least July 1 of 2026, which is when this new plan goes into effect, then they would be eligible for either the RAP plan or the standard 10-year repayment plan. The RAP plan is very different from how we have in federal law and regulation constructed income-driven repayment plans. One main reason is that the RAP plan will have significant more costs for individuals because it does include a minimum payment that is not zero. In former iterations of repayment, payments could be zero. If you essentially did not earn enough money, you could pay nothing. The RAP plan is also more expensive than former iterations of repayment plans because it's based on gross income and not discretionary income. It has a longer repayment period than we've seen in previous iterations. Payments are also based on the rate of 1% and 10% of income of AGI, which is different from other forms of repayment plans in the past. So overall, I'd just like to say that this RAP plan is going to likely increase monthly payments for individuals, at least for the median households, especially relative to previous versions of what many know as the SAVE plan. There are also other plans that were previous to the SAVE plan, where many analyses show that the RAP plan would lead to increased costs. And it's also important to note that for current borrowers will have access to the RAP plan as well, and would be eligible to enroll in the current standard, graduated, extended, and the current income-based repayment plan. So again, I've mentioned there's a lot of complexity in the loan system. One change that happens in this law is that there is a lot of consolidation across plans, and primarily on the income-driven plans. RAP is available to new borrowers, and current borrowers both could be eligible for RAP and income-based repayment. On the income-based repayment plan, the change that happened there is that there's no longer a requirement for partial financial hardship, and certain consolidated parent plus loans could be eligible for the IBR plan. Next slide, please. And then just to close out, I just wanted to share a bit of what this all means in practice and what I think we can expect to see risks, both for students, for borrowers, as well as for the system at large. So because we expect student loan payments to increase and for student loan borrowers to be less likely to be able to afford their loans, I think we will see delinquencies and defaults spike among student loan borrowers. Delinquencies are essentially when an individual is late for a payment that shows up on a credit report after 90 days, and defaults are functionally when you default on a loan, it takes 270 days to default on a student loan, which not only negatively impacts credit, but has a lot of other negative implications for individuals. I think another risk that we are likely to see is that, as you all likely have tracked over many years, the Department of Education has had diminished capacity, not only in this term, but the Department of Education does not have a lot of resources to take on large implementation challenges. One component that is going to be required by the Department of Education to execute in order to have the RAP plan become available next July, which is very, very quick turnaround, is that the department is going to have to work with all of its operational vendors, its student loan servicers, to be able to not only set up the operational systems to have all of this executed, but also to ensure that loan servicers are able to answer questions from student loan borrowers. And given the number of cuts that we've seen at the Department of Education, we are likely to see many implementation challenges with not only mitigating confusion among borrowers, but standing up the specific repayment program. So I think it will be very important to monitor how that goes and to work with the Department of Education to ensure that students and borrowers' questions are being answered in a timely manner. And then lastly, I'll just close with saying that, this is one snapshot, I think, of the impact of safety net programs and provisions being diminished among households. But I do think that this is part of an overall a trend that we're seeing across federal government programs where households today are just have less and less opportunity to enroll in or to benefit from safety net programs. So I would just ask folks on this call to consider that, and thank you again for all of your work to ensure that students and borrowers are familiar with the benefits available to them. And with that, I will turn it back to Bryce.
Thanks, Vivian. Appreciate that overview of some of the really complicated loan changes in particular. We will turn to questions and answers here in a minute. So if you have some you'd like to input into our Q&A system for us to either type out or answer live, please think about doing that now over the next couple of minutes while we have left with you. But just to wrap up what you've heard from Mark and Gina and Jessica and Vivian about what OB3 did, we are talking about a wide scale of changes that are going to really impact millions of students and their families when we already have a severe crisis of basic needs and security. We're facing federal financial aid in particular becoming more scarce as students have less ability to borrow, particularly for their non-tuition costs, and increased pressures in the repayment system that folks will worry about while they're in school, which will discourage their ability to borrow for non-tuition costs or their desire to borrow. We already know that there are so many students who choose not to take out federal student loans to cover things that might be able to help them with their food, their housing, transportation, and childcare. And while we understand the pressures and the scary nature of student debt, sometimes that it might be the only lifeline available to students when they're already confronting many challenges in their ability to stay enrolled in higher education. We see massive cuts coming to the SNAP program that are going to have a trickle down or rolling down effect on states and their budgets, including limitations of the benefits in the future. A significant increase in healthcare costs and Medicaid work requirements, which we haven't been able to touch on today, that will also eventually impact students who are enrolled on Medicaid. Tax policy becoming less generous, particularly for student loan borrowers, directing more benefits toward wealthier taxpayers and corporations. And all of these impacts together, like we said, will have major stakes for states as they are increasingly squeezed, see their revenues go down and their reimbursements from the federal government for key federal programs go down, which typically then results in tuition increases or cuts to other programs at the state level. So from the Hope Center and all the other panelists here today, it's safe to say that we are very worried that student basic needs and security will be increasing dramatically over the next few years. And we're looking forward to working with all of you to try to figure out how we help students in this dark time, how we can step in to both eventually reverse federal policy changes that are damaging to students, but also work together at the institution, system, and state levels to try to backfill or to make up for some of the harm that we're seeing for students and that we're gonna be confronting with, because this is an urgent challenge in terms of student success and keeping students enrolled in their ability to graduate with a degree that could change their lives and their own career and education trajectory. So now we're going to turn to questions. We appreciate you attending today's webinar. And I'm going to start with just one question before we go to some of those who have come in the Q&A form. And this will be to any of our panelists who want to answer it. You know, the scale of what we're talking about today it's going to increase hunger. It's going to increase student loan debt. It's going to cause significant challenges for students. What do you think some of the steps are that colleges and universities themselves, down at the actual institution level, can take today that can help students mitigate some of these harms, that can push back? Where can colleges and universities actually prioritize their own supports or their own programs to help meet some emerging student needs and those that are about to get even worse in the coming years?
I can start and Vivian can take over, but I'll say from SNAP, we keep talking about SNAP, but we know that the government accountability reports have always said in your own wonderful work, Bryce and Mark, people are not accessing SNAP because of all of these barriers, right? And we, at higher ed institutions, you can talk to your financial aid offices, you can talk with your disability offices. How do we exempt individuals from these work for food requirements? How do we make it easier for people to not be ashamed of accessing SNAP? How do we create SNAP so it looks like another financial aid program? But I said it looks like it, so a student's like, oh no, this is just like financial aid, but it is for food, right? So this is ongoing conversations that needs to happen at your general counsel level, at your president level, at your trustee level. And so because it needs to start on top, so that all of the levers, all the professors, financial aid, disability accommodations, all of these folks are talking about SNAP in a way where we can break down our biggest hurdle, which is access, knowledge, and stigma.
Gina said everything I was going to say, so I will just add that I think one, I would say like soft power that colleges have, particularly public colleges, is that they have connections with local and state governments, and that you know, a lot of times and to I think this is a merited point, colleges do need more resources, but one thing that they can do without resources is or maybe not without resources, but one thing that could help mitigate that when you have low resources is to do coordination and coordinating with local governments, with community-based organizations in the area, ensuring that students sort of have community supports on their college campuses. We know that among low-income students, you know, really having a sense of belonging on their college campus, even with financial barriers, can really help ensure student success overall. So I think, you know, focusing on student success and leveraging the networks that colleges have could be really, really helpful.
I have a couple of thoughts. I would second exactly those. I love the idea of leveraging institutional soft power locally and in the state context. I would say two things. One, you know, institutions have increasingly been good at measuring the sort of scale and scope of student basic needs on campus and what students are experiencing. I would say that's more important than ever, because we know the experience, while we know, you know, basic needs insecurity has been a problem for as long as we've been measuring it, the sort of shift in what types of things students are facing, I think, is going to be key to sort of surging supports over the next into the coming months and years, right? So making sure you're sort of keeping your finger on the pulse of what students are experiencing is obviously a necessary, if insufficient, solution. The second thing I would say, we haven't really touched on it as much today, but really making sure that there is a robust set of emergency aid resources on campus, and making sure that that aid is delivered in a timely way, that it's out the door quickly, that students know about it and are aware of it. Because again, students may be facing a SNAP cliff, right, in the coming days, literally. They may see their eligibility for something else be in question, or they're just sort of facing all of the pressures we know students are facing out there. We know that emergency aid can be a really good resource to help keeping students enrolled who otherwise would be dropping out. And the last thing I'll say is that Gina sort of touched on this and there's sort of a whole of institution approach to making sure students are enrolled in the public benefits for which they're eligible, right? We know the SNAP student rules have not changed, and that far fewer students were accessing SNAP than could have over the past several years. Making sure you're simplifying and aligning programs and outreach supports where possible, right? If there's a promise program on your campus, if there's one benefits access program, if there's a financial aid program that's really unique to your school, making sure you're combining that with efforts on public benefits outreach as much as possible, I think can really help where students are still, able to access resources.
I'll throw in just a couple of quick things on that point. I just want to emphasize what Mark said about documenting. While unfortunately the what we're staring down right now, there's no individual entity, not even a state, not an institution that can fully plug the gaps that are being faced, unfortunately. But making sure that you're documenting what is happening and what the results of that are for your students. So did you have a post-secondary student success grant or a basic needs grant that you lost? A child care funding that was lost? SNAP being lost by students? Loan access, sort of, pushing students out, TRIO programs that have been, frozen or people laid off, right? And making sure that you're really doing what is possible to bring awareness to the real impacts of that for students, and of course for staff at institutions as well, because when the window comes to be able to, roll back some of this or make new investments, right? We want to be able to make it really clear that these were decisions that were made and that they did have impacts for people, and that these were investments that were making a difference. And so really, really making sure that we're putting the effort into doing that, and keeping our finger on the pulse too, as Mark said, of what the needs are. But the other thing I just want to say, and a couple people have brought this up in questions, is that thinking about other ways around some of the plummeting confidence that folks are having, partly related to all of this in higher ed in general, making sure that you are finding those ways to really emphasize that federal loans are still the safest way to cover that bill for college, that enrolling versus not enrolling is still really the evidence-based thing to do that pays off over a long period of time. Again, if you complete a quality, affordable credential, this is not something that people should be questioning or pushed away from. And this is part of what they are really trying to do here, right? Is to narrow access based on background. And so thinking about how you can help to change those conversations, and whether there are other efforts going on that you have ongoing that some of you, if you're in institutions, might be already a part of. If you've got direct admissions projects or pilots running, if you've got transfer work happening, if you're out in communities with partnerships to create FAFSA support or helping people navigate the loan system, those are all things that are going to help as well, right? So I just want to mention those few things.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And just to emphasize what I did drop in the chat, I'm not sure if it's appearing since we did take off the public chat. We're just extending here just by another 2 minutes, so we can take at least one more question before we close out with you all. The question I'll pose to the group, even though I know Gina had to leave us, would be if folks could maybe just give a sort of quick answer about what specifically changed on SNAP rules for students or those enrolled in higher ed, and maybe a potential example of what that might look like, what's on the horizon for students specifically.
I can do that very, very quickly. So I think the main thing that I think is important, just in terms of myth busting exercise, is that the student exemptions for for SNAP have not been touched. I do think it is important, and Gina touched on the sort of new expanded work requirements or work reporting requirements that will impact students in higher education who are enrolled less than half time. So the current student rules in SNAP or the student exemptions apply if you're attending college more than half time. But for those who are attending part-time, right, they're sort of subject to the broader requirements that other families face. So the work recording requirements expand from age 54 to up to age 65. So older students who are enrolled less than half time. It institutes new work requirements on SNAP participants with children over 14. It was previously over 18. So parenting students that are enrolled less than half time, there are no more exemptions for some veteran groups, those experiencing homelessness, former foster youth. So there are groups that are sort of going to see to be required to meet these new or expanded work requirements if they're sort of attending college less than half time. There's also, I think it's really important also, and I think Gina might have mentioned this earlier, and there's been a lot of information, so even I'm forgetting, is that there are limits to updates to the Thrifty Food Plan for SNAP, which is a fancy way of saying that future benefits are going to have a de facto cut. Updates to sort of the Thrifty Food Plan, which can increase benefit levels along with rising food prices, are now sort of limited to every 5 years. They have to be what's called cost neutral. So what we're very likely to see is a extreme limitation on any benefit increases in the future, which again amounts to a de facto cut, especially when food prices are rising. Sorry, that was rapid fire, but hopefully I covered most of it.
A lot to digest, and a lot on the horizon for SNAP in particular. We're going to go ahead and close out this amazing webinar today. I know that we did not get to all of your questions. However, we are more than happy at the Hope Center to try to take some by email. If you'd like to follow up with us, there are some contact information attached to the registration form that you might have received, that we can talk with you about some of the questions you might have remaining after this webinar, and also if any of our panelists want to respond to those, we'll direct them appropriately as well. Thank you for your time and your attention to this issue. The scale of student basic insecurity is obviously huge, on an unacceptable level, and getting worse. And we know it takes a lot of time and attention for you to devote to understanding these federal policy changes and figuring out what to do about them on the ground, and how to work toward policy change in the future that is paints a better vision for our students. So appreciate all of the time today in attending this webinar, and we will be sharing the slides and a recording of the webinar with you. I know we got a few questions to that extent, to that effect afterwards, so look forward to us sending that along to you shortly. And thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you next time.